Hi everybody, this is my spoiler review for The 10th of December by George Saunders. This is a book collection of 10 short stories that have mostly appeared in the New Yorker. So if you don't want to buy the series, you can actually read most of these stories, if not all of them. I didn't check the other ones, but at least all the ones that are in the New Yorker, you can read them online for free. I think you can read the other ones online as well. I know that you can read the Chivalric Fiasco online. And I don't know about Styx. So first, let me just let you know which stories are in this collection. In the collection is Victory Lap, Styx, Puppy, Escape from Spiderhead, Exhortation, Roosten, Semplica Diaries, Home, The Chivalric Fiasco, and 10th of December. Now, I had read two of these stories previously for the Literary Roadhouse podcast. I had previously read Escape from Spiderhead and the Semplica Diaries. I really enjoyed them. One thing that was really different for me was that these stories had quite a bit of humor, which I don't normally read a lot of humor, but it was like a really dark, almost gallows humor. And all the stories seemed to deal with the breakdown of family or to deal with class in some way, which I thought was really interesting. George Saunders definitely has a style, he definitely has a tone, but he tends to play a lot, which is something I really, really enjoy. For example, in Victory Lap, he's playing a lot with punctuation and like bracket marks. He does something similar in the Semplica Diaries, where he's playing with the form of a man who's turning 40 and he's writing in his journal, and these journal entries don't sound like George Saunders at all. It sounds like just an average person who's writing in a journal, and it's shorthand and he's skipping words, and it feels really real. I read the story in two ways. I read it in audiobook and in ebook. I definitely prefer the ebook for this particular collection. I felt like his stories are so dense that listening to them in audiobook, I definitely lost a lot of the depth of the stories. And the stories I listened to in audiobook, a lot of them I did have to go back and reread as an ebook. I got my ebook from my local library. I can't remember if it was through Overdrive or through another one of their ebook providers, but I was able to get it at my local library. So since this is the spoiler review, and since my memory's kind of fuzzy, we're going to go through these stories one at a time. So my favorite three stories were Escape from Spiderhead, definitely right up there. Home is right up there. Victory Lap. You'll notice that all three of those stories are a little bit on the longer side. His super, super short stories are really dense and they're very good, but they didn't stick with me to the point where I have to look at a list to remember what they were, because I forget what Styx was. I forget the Chivalric Fiasco. Those stories didn't stay with me, even though I might have enjoyed them at the time. I definitely did enjoy the Chivalric Fiasco, but it had no holding power. And Roosten, I felt very distant in that story, and I didn't really enjoy that particular read. Victory Lap hit me hard, and I thought it was a really great choice for this first story in the collection. You're dealing with a young girl who's a teenager, and she really doesn't have a care in the world, and she's thinking about her crushes and who her future prince might be, and she's kind of self-involved. She's not very aware of her surroundings or even paying attention to other people. It seems like, it's all about her. And then she goes to the door, and this man's at the door, and she has this gut instinct that she should close the door, but she doesn't do it. And this man tries to kidnap her. And across the street is a boy who has had a crush on her for ages, and he's a really good kid. He does what he's supposed to do. His family's very regimented, almost militaristic in the way that they give him chores and what he has to do and what time he has to do it, and he's really a high-achieving student, and he's watching this girl being dragged across her yard towards this van, and he has to make a choice. Does he try to rescue her or not? And he is supposed to be putting geodes in the yard, the fancy, expensive rocks in the yard, and supposed to be doing in chores and things, and what does he do? He does the only thing he can do. He picks up the rock and he goes out there and rescues her. And I thought it was interesting because what actually happens in the girl's nightmare at the end of the story of what could have happened are in conflict, and the idea that she's having trauma over what could have happened rather than what did happen. I thought that was really interesting. I thought that the way it was written was really interesting. It definitely got me into how George Saunders writes a little bit more, and his artistic use of punctuation and grammar was something that I took away from that story as a writer, and to the point where in my very next story, I found myself wanting to use brackets in an interesting way. I had an issue with one of my writing, and I've been struggling over how to distinguish various internal voices. And a couple of the techniques he used were directly applicable to the problem I was having. And so I felt like Victory Lap was a really important story for me to have read and something that I super, super enjoyed. Styx was super short. And at first, I did not really care for that story. That is a story about a man who, his wife dies and he's got these two kids and he's kind of just lost. And so what does he do? He puts sticks up in the front yard in the shape of a cross and he dresses it up as different things depending on the holiday or the occasion. And as time goes by and the kids get older, the things he dresses the sticks up as become darker and darker. And there's a sense that it's not a happy family. There might even be some abuse, or he just might be distant and kind of on the gruff side. And the way that he's expressing his feelings is through how he's dressing up these sticks in the front yard. The visual that really stayed with me for Styx was the visual of the big cross being dressed up and then little baby crosses all around as if the stick had children. I thought that was an interesting visual, and it definitely stuck with me. The problem with that story for me was that if I wasn't a writer, I probably would have only read the story one time, and I wouldn't have fully understood it necessarily enough to enjoy it. I would have read it and thought, that was interesting, and probably just moved on and not really thought about it. The ending of that story, I really liked. I think the ending is what turned that story for me. Like, it flipped it from this is interesting to, oh, I really like this. Because then after the father dies, the kids sell the house and the new family moves in, and the first thing they do is they take these sticks out of the front yard and they put them in the garbage. And the way it was stated was in a way that enlightened the underlying meaning of the story, the sense of passing, the sense of impermanence, the way that this man was trying to connect with his family the only way he could was really enlightened by the way that particular story ended. Puppy was similar. Puppy got to me. That was a story about two women, approximately the same age. One has children and they're down and out and they don't live in a great house, but she's doing the best she can. And they have an extra dog, and her husband is going to have to kill the dog if they can't get rid of it. And so she's trying to find a family for this dog so that her husband doesn't have to kill the dog. And then this other family who is, the soccer mom with the kids and the lessons and the nice car, and they're driving to go look at this dog, and initially they're going to get the dog, but the first woman has a disabled son who has crossed the highway, and she was afraid that he was going to get killed. She was told that by the authorities, if she couldn't control him, they were going to have to send him to a facility. And so she ties him out like a dog in the backyard. He is on a leash in the backyard tied to a tree. And the woman sees this child through the window, and she just can't deal. And she says that she doesn't want to support that, anything that supports that. And getting the dog in some way is in some way supporting this child being stuck out there in the yard. Whereas you have this other mother who's thinking, this child in the backyard, that's his whole world, and he's happy out there, and it's safer for him than being running across the street. And so the way these two women are seeing this child, and in two different ways, it was heartbreaking. And when the well-off woman decides not to get the dog, my soul just hurt so much because, as the woman said, you kill animals if they're lame or if they're extra, and it's just extra. And so rather than having her son kill the dog, she takes the dog out to the field and lets him go. And I thought that the parallel between the dog and the son was really strong and absolutely heartbreaking. I've always loved Escape from Spiderhead. I think for me it would have been stronger with a little less humor, but that particular story I think kind of needed it because it gets so dark so quickly that without the funny names to the drugs and without like the little bits of gallows humor, it would almost turn me off as a reader. And that story is a story that always sticks with me. It's not one that I have to sit and think, what was the name of that? What was the name of that? It's just there. The two stories that I liked the least was Al Roosten. I don't even remember that story. Read it twice, cannot tell you what it was about. Some dude who is doing some sort of charity thing, and he's not happy, and there's somebody else there doing a charity thing, like one of those, where you walk, it's like a fashion show, you walk around and women bid for a date for you. It was like that kind of charity thing. And something about it just didn't click for me. And for that, I think it might have actually been the humor. It started off in a really humorous way, and there was like a lightness to it, even though the subject matter was dense and important, that the lightness to it it didn't click with me. And aside from a few scenes here and there, I couldn't even tell you what it was about. I definitely remember him kicking the keys under the bleachers, and the sense that he was constantly living in the past, remembering things and thinking about the future in like a really fantastic, imaginary way. But aside from that, I really couldn't tell you what it was about. The other one that I really didn't like was a Chivalric Fiasco, and that one was written in such a jovial, humorous manner that it did not click with me at all. And it's not that there was anything wrong with the story, it's just that it didn't have any emotional impact. Like, at no point did I feel close to any of the characters. I didn't feel close to Martha, the woman that was raped by her boss. I didn't feel close to the guy that caught them when they both were promoted in order to keep her mouth shut. I didn't really have an emotional response. I definitely foresaw the danger when he took the drug that's supposed to make him chivalrous. I definitely foresaw what was going to happen on that, so that when it did happen, when this drug made him out his boss for what he had done, it had no surprise. It didn't have an impact because I first saw it so early. One thing that George Saunders does that I think is kind of cool is when he has to make up names to like a drug or like a business or something, some of his names are really freaking ludicrous and they're kind of hysterical. And so, yeah, I do enjoy that part of his stories. One story I really, really liked that I actually had problems with was the 10th of December. I struggled with that because you have two different main characters, okay, and it's told from 2 points of view, but inside both main characters, they're having internal dialogues with multiple people. And so at numerous places in the story, I was lost. I had no idea who was talking to who. At one point, the young boy was talking to the girl he has a crush on, and I was like, is she really there? I'm confused. What's happening? Are we still in his head? Or did something change? Is he dead? In some ways, it worked because, they're going out in the snow, and they're both going to end up near death, and it definitely had like that confusion to build a fire kind of feel. But it was confusing enough that it was easy to lose me. And that story in particular, that is not a story you can multitask with. It is not a story you can listen to in audio format. It is not a story you can set down and come back to it later. I tried. I read like half of it, set it down, came back to it later and was like, I have no idea where I'm at, and had to start over because that story demands all your attention. And that's one thing that I found in this particular collection is George Saunders expects a lot from the reader. He's going to write what he's going to write, and you're either going to come along for the ride or just go away and read something else. He doesn't do a lot of babying. He doesn't do a lot of explanation. There's a lot of assumptions, and you just kind of have to go with him with it. And if you're not able to do that, no F's are given. And 10th of December was definitely one of those stories. But at the same time, while I was confused, the emotional payoff was so great that it was worth the ride. And at the end of the story, it stuck with me. It definitely stuck with me. It's not one of my top 3, particularly because I felt like the level of confusion is a flaw in that story. Just as a writer and and dealing with my own stories and trying really hard to balance between having some confusion, having some ambiguity, but also not leaving my readers completely lost. It's something that I'm kind of sensitive to, and it definitely stood out in that story, even though the payoff and the characters were so great. What could have helped it? Some of the techniques he used in the other stories. If he had done some really interesting way of tagging the voices, I would have enjoyed the story a lot more, because really that was the only flaw I had for 10th of December was constantly, when the character would switch from talking to one person in his head to talking to another person in his head, and it wasn't entirely clear all the time. That's really the only fault I have with that story. So do I recommend this book, this collection? I do. I loved it. I think the stories definitely fed off of each other. I think it said a lot about the human condition, definitely said a lot about family. Home in particular, like that story is my jam. That was such an amazing, amazing short story. And I think reading them one after another adds something to the experience of reading these stories. Because I've read 2 of the stories on their own and I enjoyed them, but having read multiples and then rereading them, the experience was definitely very different. And so I do recommend it. That said, most of these stories are available online for free. So unless you want that physical book or you want to just have a copy for ease of going from one story to the next, there's no reason why you can't look up 10th of December and then go to the New York Times and look up Victory Lap and look up Home and read them that way. But I enjoyed it, and I think it is definitely up there as far as top short story collections. And anyone that's interested in short stories, I would hand this to them, especially because a lot of the short stories that I read tend to have really complex language or whatever. And these, even though they had a level of depth, the writing itself is really simple and easy to digest. And I think it's great for people that are new to short stories. If you are new to short stories and you pick up 10th of December, couple hints of advice. These are definitely short stories that need to be read in one sitting. I would also recommend you don't try to read them back to back. If you're fairly new to short stories, I always recommend read a short story, wait a day, maybe 2, then read the next short story. That way you really have time to digest it. And if you can, read the short story twice, especially when you're talking about the shorter ones, like Sticks or Puppy. I definitely got a lot more out of the second reading than I did out of the first reading. If you are used to reading short stories, you're going to zoom through this collection. It's only 10 stories. They go really quickly. It only took me, 3 days to get through it. And I enjoyed them a great deal. So that is my review. If I were to rate it 0 to 5, like Goodreads style, I think I rated it a 4 on Goodreads. It was really, really good, but the sky didn't open and the angels didn't sing for several of the stories, so I can't really give it a full 5, but it was really, really high up there. And on that note, ciao.